Hello everyone, this is Professor Butler and welcome to your online video lecture. This video lecture today is an introduction to Emily Dickinson. So it's very much connected to the assigned reading that you have. The reading will give you the argument of a scholar named Rachel Wetzsteon who can give you the real critical background information that you need about Emily Dickinson in order to understand her poetry and her historical time period that she comes from. So this is going to be an accompaniment to that assigned reading that goes over a lot of the arguments suggested by Rachel Wetzsteon and also explains the key terms and the key kind of phrases that she's using if you're unfamiliar with the academic, literary, critical style of writing, or if you're struggling with that kind of language. You'll have this as a guide to work through that reading with you to really make it all make more sense. This picture that I've put up on my first introduction slide is taken from about 1870. It's a photograph of Emily Dickinson's childhood home where she lived pretty much her entire life. So that's going to be a really critical idea and a critical image as we go through Emily Dickinson's background together. So I wanted you to have that. So our goals for this video lecture assignment are pretty much twofold. First, as I mentioned, to understand the historical context of Emily Dickinson and her work. It's very likely that you're familiar with Emily Dickinson, that you possibly studied her in high school or elsewhere before. That's wonderful and excellent, but the more advanced you get in your English courses, the more you're going to realize that there are many, many elements and facets about an author and about their historical moment that can help you understand their work better and better and better. So even if you have read her before, you haven't read her from this angle before, and you won't have read her in the way that we're going to read her work together throughout the first 1/3 of our class together. And that leads us to our second goal, which is to learn the key literary devices that will help you analyze Dickinson's poems throughout the semester. So if you're unfamiliar with the term literary devices, those are terms that help you as a reader to appreciate and interpret a literary work, and that are also going to be your tools for close reading that work, which is the technique that we're going to use throughout our various texts, including Emily Dickinson and others, this semester. So close reading is a word you've probably heard an English professor use before, but I really want you to understand what that means and why it's important to an intermediate level English class like ours. So close reading is a way of discussing and or writing about literature, and what it does is it pays careful attention to the individual details of a small amount of text. So pause and think about that for a moment. The individual details, the slight tiny nuances and choices within a small amount of text. So this is why Emily Dickinson is such a great poet to practice this sort of technique on, because her poems are short and small, but what we see is that they do so much awesome stuff in such a small amount of time. So what close reading does is analyze specific meanings instead of a general theme or an overall summary. So if at any point in your past English classes you've had to summarize a book or a poem, or you've had to think about its themes overall, I mean, that's important and good to know what a poet is talking about, but that's not going to be the strategy that we're using this semester together. Close reading really allows you to take a small bit and add your own opinion and idea and interpretation to it. And as long as you can support your interpretation, your close reading, with details, literary devices, historical contexts, or ideas that are truly present in those small lines of the poem, you won't be wrong. It's really a place where your individuality can thrive and where you can practice, like we are going to practice all semester, your critical reading, your critical writing, your critical thinking abilities to really come up with your own opinion and not just assuming that there's a right or wrong answer, because there won't be throughout your assignments in this class. So on that note, I will give you a handout which you can get on our course sites page under the helpful handouts tab, and it's going to have all of these terms on it. these are going to be the terms that you use throughout this lecture. So what I want you to do as you're listening to this lecture, the PowerPoint slides with definitions are going to come up periodically throughout the lecture as you listen and work through it. So as you learn the definitions, I want you to fill them out on the homework handout sheet that you can download, like I said, from our course site's webpage, or if you don't have access to that, you can just make a quick list of these terms right here and then define them as you go along. So here's our photo of Emily Dickinson. This is actually a daguerreotype, which is an early form of photography that used much different technology, different chemicals. It took a lot longer and was far more expensive. And that was the sort of photographic technology available in 1830s and the 1840s, the time when Emily Dickinson was a young girl. So she was born in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1830. She came from a very well-read family. Her family was well known and they were successful. Her grandfather had been a founder of Amherst College, and her father was also an important and well-educated person. He was a lawyer and also worked at Amherst College. So these were well-known family people. They were well-educated, but they were also very religious. This was common at the time to be strictly religious, but for Emily Dickinson, she would later find that that wasn't quite right for her, and she would rebel against her religious family. Her household had a lot of books growing up, and she was well educated because of that, but her father would sometimes censor the things that she could read, and her mother sometimes was, according to Emily Dickinson, less available than she would have liked. Regardless of that, Emily Dickinson did live at home, and when her older brother got married, his wife, so he and his wife, the brother and his wife, stayed close to the Dickinson family and actually moved in next door, so that throughout her life, Emily was always living with her family and very close to her family. In addition to reading books at home, she was well educated and she went to a good school for young women. She was able to read Shakespeare, she was able to learn foreign languages, and she also studied science and math and geology and a lot of subjects in addition to just the humanities and reading and writing. And this was very important because as we go through Dickinson's poems, we'll see that she was educated in a well-rounded way that enabled her to really understand the world around her and be involved in some of the debates of the 19th century, which included a turn a little bit more away from traditional religious beliefs and in favor of science and those sorts of points of view on the world. So this was very important for Emily Dickinson, and in fact, she went to a women's college, but found that that was not the right place for her. So she attended a Christian women's college. It was called Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, and that still exists today. But when she went there, she learned a lot and really loved learning, but was asked frequently, because it was a religious school, to declare her faith, and that was something she was not comfortable doing. So after 1 year of attending this women's Christian college, she left and went back home, where she would stay in the Massachusetts Amherst area for the rest of her life, except for a few short visits to other places in Massachusetts. She really went home and stayed there for pretty much the remainder of her time. So this is incredibly important because one of the most common images that we get of Emily Dickinson is that she was this reclusive, mysterious figure who stayed at home and didn't have a lot of friends and wasn't well understood pretty much at all. It's true that in her early 20s, Dickinson decided that she was going to dress all in white and really become more reclusive, staying at home. And that's where she became known as an eccentric. But as we look at her work together and as we think about the theme of friendship, I really want to push you guys as students and as learners to look at her work and look at her words and see what her perspective on friendship really was, and see how reclusive she was or wasn't in terms of the close reading of her work that you're able to conduct. So we do know that Emily Dickinson was never married, yet she was incredibly close to her family, particularly her sister-in-law, so her brother's wife, who we will talk about. Remember, they lived next door. She never got married, but she did write poems that were very passionate and seemed to be love poems to an anonymous person that is still debated by scholars today who that person might be. So again, as we look at not just friendship, but romance, romantic friendship, romantic love, and those sorts of ideas, we're going to investigate who Emily Dickinson was and what she was actually saying about her relationships. So in that vein, I want to look at a large chunk of a quote. This is called a block quote, which Rachel Wetzsteon uses in her book on page 15. And we're going to examine this quotation as a possible source for a lot of the kind of characterizations of Emily Dickinson that we still have with us today about her being a recluse and having no friends and being someone who just really wasn't understood. So remember that because this was 200 years ago, we don't have a lot of surviving documents. We do have some, but not a lot of surviving documents about Emily Dickinson in the point of view of other people. So this one that we do have was written by a young woman named Mabel Loomis Todd, and it was simply a letter that she wrote home to her parents when she moved to Amherst and realized that there was a kind of strange, eccentric figure living there who was one of her neighbors. So here's the quotation from Mabel Loomis Todd. "I must tell you about the character of Amherst. It is a lady whom all the people call the Myth. She is a sister of Mr. Dickinson and seems to be the climax of all the family oddity. She has not been outside her house in 15 years, except once to see a new church when she crept out at night and viewed it by moonlight. No one who calls upon her mother and sister ever sees her, but she allows little children once in a great while, and one at a time, to come in, when she gives them cake or candy or some nicety, for she is very fond of little ones. But more often she lets down the sweetmeat by a string out of a window to them. She dresses wholly in white, and her mind is said to be perfectly wonderful. She writes finely, but no one ever sees her. Her sister invited me to come and sing to her mother sometime. People tell me the Myth will hear every note. She will be near, but unseen. Isn't that like a book? So interesting." So this quotation is really, really fascinating. She is giving local nicknames like the Myth to Emily Dickinson. She's calling her a character in italics, as if that means something like a fictional person, an unreal person. When she says, "Isn't that like a book?" that's what Mabel Loomis Todd means. She means, doesn't this sound like a made-up person that you would read in an intriguing mystery story or something like that? So Emily Dickinson was very secluded from the rest of the world, but because her family were important people, there were major figures, especially literary and philosophical and political figures, who might have visited or might have known her family, might have come through the house, and lent this idea to the neighbors that this was a very unusual person. So, as Mabel Loomis Todd does say, Dickinson was indeed a good writer, a wonderful writer, in fact, with just a fabulous mind. But in her lifetime, very few of her works were ever published. However, this isn't to say that Emily Dickinson was never interested in publishing or interested in reaching out, because in fact she was. So I want you to think about this also in terms of our class themes of friendship and relationships, that in the 1860s, as Emily Dickinson's interest in poetry was really picking up, she actually did write to a publisher. His name was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and asked if he would offer her an opinion regarding some of the poems she had written. Now, Emily Dickinson reached out to Higginson most likely because he was a well-known publisher, but also because he was an early supporter of women's rights, and he was someone who had offered in published magazines to give advice to young writers about how to find the right audience for their work. So as a young woman, especially an unmarried woman who was more politically forward-thinking, remember she was not traditionally religious, she was kind of thinking in her own progressive way, she thought that Thomas Wentworth Higginson would be the exact right person to ask about her poetry. So she wrote to him, she sent him 4 poems, and asked if he might tell her, quote, "If my verse is alive. Should you feel it breathed, and had you leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude." End quote. So this is her actual letter, asking if the verse is alive, asking if he feels it breathes, so that even in the non-fiction regular correspondence writing that she is sending to someone in a professional way, she is writing very poetically. Asking if the verse breathes and if it has life is a beautiful way to think of her poems, showing that she had great care for them and that she wasn't just locked away, in boredom or in some sort of, weird state, but that she was truly deeply thinking and caring about her work. So she wrote to Higginson, including her poems, with this question about if her poetry essentially was any good. And although he was a supporter of women and a supporter of early writers, her work was very different from pretty much anything that had been published before. And so he actually suggested that if she wanted to publish, she needed to revise particularly the unusual punctuation, which we'll see throughout her poems, and the unusual sentence structures, which just really didn't jive with the traditional standards of forms and rhymes and meters that people expected in poetry at the time. So she was not successful in publishing with him, and as I mentioned, only published a few small anonymous pieces in her life, but she did find a bit of a friend in Higginson, and she continued to correspond with him through letters so that she could become a part of the literary community and continue learning, again, especially because she wasn't leaving her home or going to events with literary people. She could learn through her correspondence with this publisher who was willing to give advice about what was happening in the literary community. Emily Dickinson became ill in the 1880s and passed away from her illness in 1886 when she was 56 years old. But even though she died with very little of her work published, she did become well known. She was posthumously published, that means after her death, in the late 19th century, and people have been studying and reading and enjoying her poetry ever since. So in order to really understand how interesting Emily Dickinson's poetry is and how artful and intelligently done her writing is, we're going to learn some literary terms now. So this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the lecture. The first term is pretty self-explanatory. That would be a line of poetry. That's just one line on the page. And the second term is a stanza. A stanza is a grouped set of lines that are put together by the poet either for an artistic reason or a technical one. Obviously, an artistic reason in very modern poetry would just be the way that it looks or the pauses that it gives you to think about the words of the poem. But in a technical sense, Emily Dickinson was using an understood style of poetry and an understood form of poetry just in a very uncommon way. So Emily Dickinson took her technical poetry form from hymns. So those would be in church, your songs that you sing. That's actually the kind of technical grouping of stanzas and grouping of lines that Emily Dickinson was drawing from. However, in a hymn, you would be singing about religion, particularly about God, singing worship songs. But Emily Dickinson was writing about nature, writing about feelings, writing about death in a very often Greco-Roman sort of pagan way, right? That she was speaking of death as a figure rather than as a kind of Christian understanding of life and death. And she would write about science and things that were a little more controversial at the time. So she's using a structure taken from hymns, and this structure is called common meter or common measure. So hold on to that for 1 second, because the first thing you need to know to understand this type of writing is what meter means. So meter is the rhythmic structure of a poem. And that means for us in English, the kind of stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem and the pattern in which those syllables are placed. So in order to understand meter, we use a couple of other terms. We're getting even smaller than lines, and we're looking at individual syllables within a poem. So the word that we use for this is a metric foot, and a foot is a repeated sequence of rhythm comprising of patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. So a foot has 2 or 3 syllables in it, and they follow a certain pattern. So the most commonly used foot in English poetry is called an iamb, and that simply means a foot that contains 1 short syllable followed by 1 long syllable. So our example of an iamb is the word delay, right? You don't say delay, you say delay. In contrast to that, a trochee is the opposite of an iamb because it gives the stressed syllable first and the unstressed syllable second. So listen to this word garden. You don't say garden, that doesn't sound right. You say garden. That means we're putting the stress on gar and the unstressed syllable on din. So if you're having trouble, listen one more time. Delay, delay. You can say the delay really quickly with the duh, but you have to stress the lay. Garden, you can say the din really briefly, but you have to say garden in order for the word to sound correct and to make sense. So it's not that poetry is adding stresses, it's that poetry is recognizing the existing stresses in words. So an activity that students often do in a linguistics class or an advanced poetry class is to listen to various names to ask themselves what sort of metric foot their name is in. So I'm going to give you my sister's name to begin with, Rachel. You put the stress on the first syllable, Rachel, which means that it has to be a trochee, right? You don't say Rachel, that would be trying to make it an iamb when it isn't. You say Rachel. Now, let's come up with an example of a name in an iamb. One might be the singer Adele. That's because we have an unstressed syllable first, and then del is the stressed syllable. If you were talking about the singer Adele, you couldn't say Adele. You have to say Adele. So the little of Adele is much less stressed than the del portion of that name. So hopefully this has given you a helpful contrast of different metric feet. There are many, many more sorts of feet, including 2 stressed syllables, 2 unstressed syllables, and groups of 3 syllables, but we don't need to worry about those for the sake of our class. The main thing I want you to understand is an iamb, and the fact that Emily Dickinson's poetry is going to use groups of iambs in order to form common measure, also called common meter. So, we're used to seeing an iambic line in something like Shakespeare. So now what I'm going to do is give you some iambic lines and mark out how you can see each iamb in groups of 5 forming a line of Shakespearean poetry. So when you say, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate." Those are I am, 5. I am, 5. So Emily Dickinson does something similar, but not quite the same as Shakespeare. And what she does, and what common meter is using one line of 4 I ams, followed by one line of 3 I ams, followed by 4 I ams, followed by 3 I ams. So one stanza in common meter or common measure is 4, 3, 4, 3, each line having that number of I ams. So listen carefully and you'll see our example of Emily Dickinson with the I ams sounding like this. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Okay, so look at that. Because, 1, I could, 2, not stop, 3, for death, 4. So there's 4 in our first line. He kind, there we go, 1. Lee stopped, 2, for me, 3. So this grouping of a stanza that contains a line of 4 I ams, followed by a line of 3 I ams, followed by 4 I ams, followed by 3 I ams, that is common measure, and that was the sort of line that was used in hymns. So if you're familiar with Amazing Grace, a very common hymn from religious groups, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, 4 and, that's a 4 I am line. That saved a wretch like me, 1 and, 2 and, 3 and, that would be an example of common measure. In other words, you could pretty much sing any of Emily Dickinson's songs to the tune of Amazing Grace. Not that you have to do that, but it helps you understand that even though we don't really recognize a particular need for structure in Emily Dickinson's work because we're not familiar with those technical terms anymore, there really was one, and it's common in virtually all of her poems. So now that we've gotten some of those literary terms to help us through our reading of Emily Dickinson, the question in order to conduct a close reading is, well, what is that literary device doing to improve some sort of artistic quality of the poem? And what we see with this example of Emily Dickinson using common meter or common measure in her poetry that is not about religious subjects, even though those are religious structures, is really open for discussion. We could say that having a religious structure is somehow honoring her subjects as if they are holy and beautiful and godlike. That would be one excellent reading. But on the other hand, we could say that she's defying religion by using religious structures to talk about something that is not, in fact, religious. So this is where using the term of the common meter to conduct your own interpretation with close reading is a lot of fun and leaves a lot of possibilities open for you. Now that we've gotten through one of the most challenging elements of Emily Dickinson's poetry, I'd like to move on to a few other examples of literary devices and techniques that Emily Dickinson employs throughout her work. The first one is fairly simple, and that's personification. So in the poem that we just saw, Emily Dickinson wrote, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." And that's an example of personification because it portrays an inanimate object or concept, in this case, as if that thing is a person. So I've highlighted the word he because death, which is not a person, it happens to a person but in itself is an abstract idea, death is being referred to with a personal pronoun he. And that means that Dickinson is personifying that concept. Now, we've gotten that literary device to help us, but what does that personification accomplish? One could say that it makes the idea of death far more something? Is it far more interesting? Is it far more realistic? Is it far less realistic? Any of those ways of thinking about what effect personification has in these lines would help you conduct your close reading. Now, the second idea of a literary technique that I want to make sure you understand in this first lecture is a slant rhyme. And this is something that Emily Dickinson is very well known for and does a lot throughout her poetry. So a slant rhyme is exactly what it sounds like. It's when the lines of a poem almost rhyme, but not quite perfectly. They just don't get it exactly right. For this reason, you might hear someone call a slant rhyme a near rhyme or an imperfect rhyme. All of those terms are referring to the same thing, which means the rhyme is super close but just not 100% there. So I've given you an example of Emily Dickinson's lines here that say, "The heart asks pleasure first, and then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering." You see how I read it there? Pain and ing don't actually rhyme. They are really close to rhyming, but they have just a slightly different vowel sound that makes them a little different. Now, when you're reading the poem aloud, you may feel the need to kind of twist that word a little bit so that it rhymes better, and that's exactly the point. The effect of a slant rhyme is often that it makes the reader a little uncomfortable or a little uncertain, and they think maybe they should change it just a little. But what we need to recognize with a writer like Emily Dickinson is that she is using these slant rhymes on purpose. If she wanted the poem to rhyme perfectly, she could have easily chosen another word or written something else. Remember, these are very short poems that she's spending a lot of time working on, so it was a conscious choice on her part and a frequent choice on her part to choose words that rhymed really almost but not quite all the way. Now, a little note that I want you to tuck away for when we work together on slant rhymes in class is that Emily Dickinson does use perfect rhymes sometimes and then changes to slant rhymes later in the same poem. So if you're ever reading and you see the first two stanzas or the first one stanza of a Dickinson poem has perfect rhymes, but then in the end shifts into imperfect slant rhymes, that's a really good idea to consider in terms of, well, Dickinson wanted some parts to be really comfortable and really perfect in their rhyme, but other parts to be less comfortable. Maybe that emphasizes some uncomfortable feeling that Emily Dickinson wants to incite in the reader towards the end of the poem. So those are two devices, and now we can move on to one more. Now this is just the term syntax. Syntax is a fancy word, a literary term for sentence structure, but the reason we need this word syntax is because we need to understand that there's a lot of implied understanding in what sentence structure means. So in the English language, our sentence structure is always subject, verb, object. You could say something like I, subject, walked, verb, my dog, object. Now that's an easy example, I walked my dog, but a poetic example, and I'm sorry this is a little depressing, but it is the example from the poem, is the soul is condemned to be alone. All right, so the soul is the subject, is the verb, and condemned to be alone is the predicate, the end of that sentence following the subject and verb. But what Dickinson frequently does in her work is begins with the object or predicate and has the subject far later in the sentence. And this is what we would call unusual syntax or out of order syntax. We would describe the syntax as not being typical for the way that English language writing is done. So I have an example down here, and in order to help you understand what is happening, I'd like you to kind of gloss the meaning of the first line, adventure most unto itself. That basically means alone. So Dickinson writes, adventure most unto itself, the soul condemned to be. And we would read that in terms of meaning as alone, the soul condemned to be. Now, there's one other critical element in the syntax here, which is that Dickinson doesn't even have a verb. Condemned is technically an adjective in this sentence. So the verb here is, but it's hidden. And that's what we call an understood verb. And it means that the poet or the writer has left out a verb, usually a simple one like is, knowing that the reader will understand that it's supposed to be there. So the reader knows that the meaning of this sentence is the soul is condemned to be alone, but the way she has phrased it is alone the soul is condemned to be, and the is just hidden and understood. Now, this is going to take a little more time working together in class to go over how you can deconstruct these sentences and find the subject and find the verb and realize that they're not in the normal English language place. But it's really helpful for realizing what element the poet wants to emphasize. Often she'll put the most important part of the sentence first, even if that's not the subject. And other times, she's playing some sort of structure game with the reader in order to make you think through the poem really hard and work on finding the meaning for yourself, which obviously is a very interesting effect of using literary devices, which we'll get to discuss and work on together as the semester continues. Now, here are a few basic but important terms that you'll encounter throughout our class. The first is the speaker. Now, the speaker is simply the person, sometimes using the pronoun I, especially in the case of Emily Dickinson, but not always, the person who is speaking in the poem. Now, it's very easy for us when we're reading Emily Dickinson, and it seems that all of these experiences and feelings that she's writing about are very close to her and very personal. It's easy for us to assume that the poet herself is the speaker. But in an intermediate literature class, you're urged to not make that assumption because, of course, a creative person is capable of putting themselves in many persons' shoes or of imagining what it's like to experience something even if they never have themselves. So our example of a speaker is really helpful. This is a first line of one of Emily Dickinson's poems, which says, "I heard a fly buzz when I died." And then the poem continues and there's more of a rumination about death. But the important thing here is that we cannot claim that Emily Dickinson herself as the poet is the speaker, because at the time when she wrote this, she was alive. She had never died before. But we know that in this poem, she's imagining what death is like rather than having experienced it herself. Now, there's a few other important terms to connect to the idea of speaker, and really these are all related. So the speaker gives us an idea of the point of view of the poem. So the point of view is just the angle through which the speaker or the poem is considering things. You might be considering it through one particular angle of, a young woman, or another particular angle of a fictional man, or another particular angle, maybe a character or an animal or something who has no actual way of telling us what they think. These are all different points of view that a poet might choose to express their poem through. But most commonly, you're going to hear two types of descriptions of point of view. The first is a first-person point of view, and the second is a third-person point of view. So the first person is just the English class term for I or me. So you've probably heard that before when you are or are not supposed to write an essay using the first person, meaning through your own perspective. And then the third person means there is no I or you, but the poem is simply telling us about he or she or they or it. The third person will have none of that I. It will instead be taking a step back and telling it more like a movie, like you're watching something happen, but you're not inside of that person's head. So those are the two most common points of view that you will get, and you'll hear those described in connection to the speaker. The next word I'd like to go over is a paradox. A paradox refers to a statement that might seem absurd, it might contradict itself, but it can actually be true or make more sense, especially when you think about it for a minute. So I'm going to give you an example from one of Emily Dickinson's poems that says, "Delight becomes pictorial when viewed through pain." So delight, being happy, and being in pain seem like real opposites. But what this poem is suggesting is that you can experience and really understand delight when you've felt pain and trouble, right? So the old idea of yin and yang, or of opposites, or of you can't know what good is unless there is an opposite force of evil in the world, all of those philosophical kind of backgrounds can play into our understanding of this poem and help us read and make sense of what she's saying, that delight becomes pictorial once you've known the opposite, once you've known what pain feels like. And in that sense, our scholar Rachel Wetzsteon suggests is that many of Dickinson's poems begin with two apparent opposites, or throughout the poem contain apparent opposites, and then use the poetry to argue that those opposite things have more in common than we as a reader would usually assume that they do. So Dickinson is trying to make us think and push the boundaries of our minds when she is using literary techniques such as this one. Another quick note with this poem is that you might be struggling with this word pictorial, and that's absolutely okay. That's why in the syllabus and in the class, I'm going to constantly encourage you to use your dictionary. There's many great apps for your phone. I use the Merriam-Webster app on my phone all the time. You can even use Wikipedia if you're just using it to look up a word and not to, write a research paper or anything. But if you see a word and you don't know what it means, Google or an app or really anything like that is going to be your best friend to make the poem really make as much sense as it needs to for you to succeed in a poetry reading and literature reading class. So when you look up this word pictorial, you learn that it means illustrated, as in like a newspaper with illustrations, something that is clearly demonstrated through pictures in a way that helps you understand that thing. So not only did I learn the synonym that pictorial means illustrated, but I looked it up online and saw that the way it's commonly used is in journalism. Dickinson chooses this very strange word, saying that delight becomes pictorial, as in you can gain illustrations and a further understanding of delight when you experience it through the point of view of someone who has also felt pain. Now we're getting into an interpretation of those words that uses Emily Dickinson's diction. So diction, you see my check mark there, is the literary term for word choice. Now you can always feel free to just use the term word choice. That's perfectly fine. But what diction allows you to do is characterize the type of word choice that is consistent throughout a poem. So you might say she uses elevated diction if she's using really fancy words. You could say she's using journalistic diction if we learn that one or more of the terms in this poem are related to newspapers or journalism. You could say that a contemporary writer uses contemporary diction. That means someone from the 21st century might use really informal diction. That would be the opposite of someone using elevated diction. Really, this term is one that allows you to more quickly kind of condense the way that you want to describe an author's word choice in order to clean up your essay or your sentence that you're saying and arguing about a piece and make it just a little more clear. Now, that's all of the terminology and strategy that I have for you for this lecture, but I would like to end by reading aloud the final concluding paragraph from Rachel Wetzsteon's article. So Rachel Wetzsteon writes, quote, "Dickinson's influence can be felt everywhere. Writers are in her thrall. Every year, the Poetry Society of America offers an award for a poem inspired by Dickinson. As Dickinson herself predicted, her light may have gone out, but the lenses of later ages keep reflecting and refracting it in all sorts of inventive and unexpected ways. The intense eyes of the young woman in the photograph will keep peering into ours for a very long time. So those are the last words that Rachel Wetzsteon offers about Emily Dickinson, so that even if she didn't have as many or the same types of relationships that we would recognize as being, outgoing and extroverted and necessary for having a big social circle in today's time, she was reaching out and touching others and speaking to others, both in her letters, which we will read some of and discuss throughout our class, and in her poems, so that when we interact with her words, we're sort of interacting with her through space and time just a little bit. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Please remember to download the handout and use this lecture to write down the definitions of each of those terms. So happy reading, happy writing, and I will see you soon.